The early morning sun streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport's Terminal Bay, casting long shadows across the busy terminal floor. Among the rushing crowds stood Robert Thompson, a 65-year-old Vietnam veteran, patiently waiting in the boarding line for Flight 2476 to San Francisco. His weathered hands gripped a simple wooden cane, a constant companion since his war injury decades ago. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Business travelers typing frantically on their laptops, families carolling excited children, and flight crews striding purposefully toward their gates. Robert adjusted his navy blue veteran's cap, a quiet symbol of his service that often drew respectful nods from passers-by. "Now boarding Group A," crackled the announcement over the speakers. Robert checked his boarding pass one more time, his fingers tracing over the seat number, 14C. He had specifically chosen an aisle seat, making it easier to stretch his leg during the long flight to visit his son. As he approached the gate, a young mother struggling with a crying baby dropped her diaper bag. Without hesitation, Robert steadied himself on his cane and carefully bent down to help her gather the scattered items. "Take your time, dear," he said with a gentle smile, remembering how his late wife used to juggle their own son's baby supplies years ago. The boarding bridge seemed longer than usual today. His knee was acting up, probably due to the changing weather. But Robert maintained his steady pace, politely waving off offers of assistance from both flight crew and fellow passengers. "I might be slower than a turtle in molasses," he chuckled to a concerned flight attendant named Rita, "but I'll get there just fine." Inside the aircraft, the overhead bins were rapidly filling up. Robert stood in the aisle, carefully pulling his carry-on bag behind him. It contained precious cargo, old family photos, and a special gift for his son. The bag wasn't particularly heavy, but lifting anything above shoulder height had become a challenge since his injury. As he reached his assigned row, Robert began the familiar struggle of lifting his bag. His arms trembled slightly with the effort, but determination showed in his eyes. A businessman in a crisp suit offered to help, but Robert smiled and shook his head. "Thank you kindly, but I need to keep proving to myself that I can do these things." Rita, who had been watching from the front galley, felt her patience wearing thin as the boarding time ticked away. The flight was already running 10 minutes behind schedule, and there were still dozens of passengers waiting to board. She drummed her fingers against the galley counter, checking her watch repeatedly. Several passengers had formed a small line behind Robert, though most showed understanding. An elderly woman commented quietly to her husband, "Remember when you were the same way after your hip surgery?" Proud as a peacock, wouldn't let anyone help. Her husband nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. The tension in the cabin grew as minutes ticked by. Robert could feel the weight of waiting eyes on his back, but he remained focused on his task. His physical therapist had always stressed the importance of maintaining independence, and this was one of those moments where he needed to prove it to himself. Just as Robert made another attempt to lift his bag, the aircraft's air conditioning kicked in, sending a cool blast through the cabin. The sudden rush of air made him grip his cane tighter, his balance slightly wavering. Unknown to him, Rita had reached her breaking point, setting the scene for what would become a viral moment that would change multiple lives forever. The morning sun continued to stream through the small aircraft windows, catching the silver wings pinned to Robert's cap. A silent testament to his years of service. In these final moments before the incident, no one could have predicted how this ordinary Monday morning would transform into an extraordinary story of redemption, connection, and the unexpected ways our lives intertwine with others. The atmosphere inside Flight 2476 had grown increasingly tense as Robert continued his careful attempts to store his carry-on bag. The overhead compartment seemed to mock his efforts, remaining just inches out of comfortable reach. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, not from the weight of the bag, but from the growing awareness of the delay he was causing. A young boy, no more than 7, watched the scene unfold with curious eyes. "Grandpa's just like you," he whispered to his mother, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "He never wants help with his suitcase either." The comment drew gentle smiles from those around them, momentarily lightening the mood in the cramped cabin. Rita, the flight attendant, checked her watch again. 20 minutes behind schedule now. Her supervisor had already radioed twice about the delay. She could feel the pressure building, There were connecting flights to consider, and the domino effect of a late departure could disrupt the entire day's schedule. The morning's earlier mechanical delay had already put them behind, and this situation wasn't helping. "Sir," Rita called out, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that barely masked her frustration, "please allow me to assist you." Without waiting for a response, she quickly moved down the aisle, her uniformed shoes clicking against the floor with determined steps. The overhead bins needed to be closed, the cabin secured, and this flight needed to depart. Robert turned slightly at the sound of her voice, his cane shifting on the carpeted floor as he tried to maintain his balance in the narrow aisle. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I can manage," he said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had faced far greater challenges. But Rita had already reached him, her patience exhausted. She pushed forward, intent on resolving the situation quickly. In her haste, her elbow caught Robert's shoulder, throwing him off balance. Time seemed to slow as his cane slipped on the carpet. The veteran's eyes widened in surprise as he felt himself falling. Several passengers gasped. Robert's hand grasped for support, finding only air as he tumbled sideways. His hip struck the armrest of 14C with a dull thud, and his cane clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the now silent cabin like a gunshot. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed an older woman in the window seat, her hands flying to her mouth. The young boy who had spoken earlier burst into tears, burying his face in his mother's shoulder. 3 passengers immediately unbuckled their seatbelts and stood to help, while others reached for their phones, their cameras already recording. A businessman in row 15 rushed forward. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, offering his steady hand to Robert. Another passenger retrieved the fallen cane, while a third advised, "Don't move too quickly. Let's make sure you're not hurt." Robert's face had gone pale, but his expression remained composed. Years of military training had taught him how to handle unexpected situations with grace. "I'm okay," he assured everyone, though his voice trembled slightly. "Just knocked the wind out of me a bit." Rita stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The frustration that had driven her actions moments ago evaporated, replaced by horror and shame. I'm so sorry," she stammered, reaching out to help, but another passenger had already stepped in to assist Robert to his feet. Through the aircraft windows, the morning sun continued to shine, now illuminating the phones that captured every moment of the incident. In the age of social media, what happened next would spread faster than any of them could imagine. The video would soon reach eyes they never expected, setting in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. As Robert slowly regained his footing, supported by caring hands of strangers, no one in the cabin could have guessed that this moment of tension and embarrassment would lead to an extraordinary story of redemption. The incident, born of impatience and misunderstanding, was about to connect lives in ways that none of them could have predicted. The next few minutes on Flight 2476 unfolded like scenes from a slow-motion film. Robert sat quietly in his aisle seat, politely declining offers of ice packs and aspirin from concerned fellow passengers. His military training had taught him to stay calm in chaos, but the dull ache in his hip served as a constant reminder of what had just happened. "Are you absolutely certain you don't need medical attention, sir?" asked a soft-spoken woman who identified herself as a nurse. She had moved from her seat in the back of the plane to check on him. Robert managed a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you, but I've had worse scrapes than this in my time." The cabin buzzed with whispered conversations and the occasional click of phone cameras. A young college student in row 16 had captured the entire incident on her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she typed out a message to accompany the video. "Just witnessed shocking treatment of an elderly veteran on Flight 2476. This isn't right. #respect to veterans." Reba stood in the galley, her face ashen as she spoke in hushed tones with the lead flight attendant. "I didn't mean to. It all happened so fast," she explained, her voice cracking. Her colleague patted her shoulder sympathetically but said firmly, "We need to file an incident report as soon as we land. This is serious." The plane finally began its taxi toward the runway, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. The delay seemed insignificant now compared to what had transpired. In row 12, a business executive in a crisp suit finished uploading the video to his social media accounts. "My father was a veteran," he muttered to his seatmate. "This kind of treatment is unacceptable." As the aircraft lifted into the cloudy Atlanta sky, no one realized that the videos were already gaining traction online. The first post had been shared over 100 times before they reached cruising altitude. By the time the drink service began, the airline's social media team was holding an emergency meeting to address the growing online backlash. Throughout the flight, passengers continued to check on Robert. A young mother offered him her neck pillow to help him sit more comfortably. An off-duty pilot who happened to be traveling as a passenger came by to express his concern and took detailed notes about the incident. "The airline will want to make this right, sir," he assured Robert. Rita made herself scarce during the flight, having another flight attendant handle her section of the cabin. When she did pass by Robert's seat, her face flushed with shame. She had tried to apologize again, but the words seemed inadequate, hollow against the gravity of her actions. Halfway through the flight, Robert pulled out an old photograph from his wallet, a picture of him and his son at a baseball game years ago. He smiled at the memory, unaware that his son would soon be watching the video of the incident, setting in motion events that would change everything. Back on the ground, the story was spreading like wildfire. The airline's customer service department was overwhelmed with calls and messages. "Have you seen the video of what happened on Flight 2476? Became a common question in offices and homes across the country. By noon, several veteran support groups had shared the video, adding their own comments about respect and dignity. A local news station in San Francisco picked up the story first. Viral video shows veterans' mistreatment on commercial flight. Their social media post included a still image from the video showing Robert's veteran's cap clearly visible as he fell. The image resonated with viewers, drawing thousands of comments within hours. Meanwhile, in the air, Robert dozed fitfully in his seat, his cane secured safely beside him. The incident had tired him more than he wanted to admit. He thought about his son waiting in San Francisco, wondering how to tell him about what happened without causing worry. His son had enough on his plate with his busy medical practice. As the flight continued westward, the story below was taking on a life of its own. News outlets began reaching out to the airline for comments. Veterans organizations issued statements. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #RespectToVeterans and #FlightAttendantShame. The airline's PR team scrambled to craft an appropriate response, knowing this could quickly become a major crisis. What no one on that flight knew, not Robert, not Rita, not any of the passengers sharing the video, was that this incident would lead to an extraordinary connection that none of them could have predicted. Sometimes, the most meaningful moments of grace come from the most uncomfortable situations, and this story was far from over. The bustling halls of San Francisco General Hospital echoed with the usual morning chaos as Dr. Thomas Thompson hurried through his rounds. His white coat pockets bulged with patient charts, and he carried his trusted coffee mug, already on his second refill of the day. As one of the hospital's top cardiac surgeons, his schedule was always packed, but today felt particularly hectic. "Doctor, you might want to check your phone," called out Nancy, a veteran nurse who had worked with him for over a decade. "There's this video going viral, and I swear the veteran in it looks exactly like your father." She held up her phone, but Thomas was already rushing to his next patient consultation. "I'll check it later," he called back, his mind focused on the complex surgery he had scheduled for the afternoon. His father was flying in today, but that wasn't until later. Right now, he had other priorities to handle. During a brief break between consultations, Thomas finally sat down in the doctor's lounge to catch his breath. He pulled out his phone, surprised to find dozens of missed calls and messages. Opening the first text, his heart nearly stopped. There was his father, captured in a shaky video, falling against an airplane seat while his cane clattered to the floor. "No, no, no," Thomas muttered, his hands trembling as he turned up the volume. The lounge around him faded away as he watched the scene unfold. He recognized his father's navy blue veteran's cap, the one he'd given him last Christmas. The quiet dignity in his father's face, even as he fell, made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. A young resident walked into the lounge, but quickly backed out, seeing the usually composed Dr. Thompson sitting there, his face a mix of shock and anger. The video had already gained millions of views, with comments pouring in from around the country. Thomas scrolled through them, his coffee forgotten and growing cold beside him. "Wait a minute," he whispered, freezing as he recognized the flight attendant in the video. His mind raced back 3 months, to a rainy Tuesday evening when a young boy was rushed into the emergency room after a terrible bicycle accident. The boy's mother, that same flight attendant, had paced the waiting room for hours while Thomas worked to save her son's life. He remembered her tears of gratitude, the way she had hugged him after the successful surgery, how she had brought homemade cookies to every follow-up appointment. The same woman who had just knocked down his father. The irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. Thomas's phone buzzed again, another message, this time from the hospital administrator. The video was generating such attention that reporters had started calling the hospital, trying to reach him for comment. His father's flight wouldn't land for another 3 hours, and already this had become a media storm. In the corner of the lounge, the TV silently played a news channel where his father's story was now running as a headline story. Thomas watched as photos of his father from his military service days flashed across the screen, followed by clips from the viral video. The contrast between the proud soldier in the old photos and the vulnerable man in the video made his throat tight with emotion. Standing up, Thomas walked to the window overlooking the busy San Francisco street below. He thought about his father's pride, how he had insisted on flying alone despite Thomas's offers to accompany him. "I'm not made of glass, son," he had said during their last phone call. "I can handle a simple flight." A text message lit up his phone. It was from the young boy's mother, the flight attendant herself. "Dr. Thompson, I just found out. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." The message trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. Thomas stared at it, unsure how to respond. How do you reply to someone who had both saved your patient's life and harmed your father? The afternoon surgery would have to be reassigned. Thomas quickly made the necessary calls, his mind already racing ahead to what needed to be done. His father would need picking up from the airport, probably medical attention despite his likely protests, and most importantly, protection from the media circus that was surely brewing. As he gathered his things to head to the airport, Thomas paused at his office door. On his desk sat a framed photo of him and his father at his medical school graduation, both beaming with pride. Next to it was a more recent picture, him with the young boy whose life he'd saved, the flight attendant's son, taken on their last follow-up visit. Life had a strange way of connecting people, he thought. This incident, as unfortunate as it was about to bring together 2 families in a way that no one could have predicted. As he hurried toward the parking garage, Thomas began to formulate a plan, one that would transform this viral moment of shame into something much more meaningful. The airline's regional office buzzed with tension as Rita sat in the conference room, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of untouched coffee. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds, creating bars of light across the polished table. 3 airline officials sat across from her, their faces grave as they reviewed the incident report. "The video has over 2 million views now," the senior manager said, sliding some papers across the table. "We've received thousands of complaints. This isn't just about a difficult passenger interaction anymore. This has become a PR crisis." Reba nodded numbly, the events of the morning playing over and over in her mind. The veteran's dignified face, the sound of his cane hitting the floor, the shocked gasps of passengers, every detail was seared into her memory. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from co-workers and friends who had seen the video. "Before we discuss your suspension," the HR representative began, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young assistant hurried in, whispering something to the senior manager. The manager's eyes widened, and he quickly pulled up something on his laptop. "Rita," he said slowly, turning the screen toward her. "Did you know who that passenger was?" On the screen was a news article showing a split image, the veteran from the flight on one side, and on the other, a photo that made Rita's heart stop. It was Dr. Thompson, standing beside her son Billy in his hospital room, both giving thumbs up to the camera. The coffee cup slipped from her hands, spilling across the table. "No," she whispered, her face draining of color. That's Billy's doctor. The one who—" Her voice trailed off as the full weight of the connection hit her. Memories flooded back. The terrifying night 3 months ago, when Billy had been rushed to the hospital after his bicycle accident. The endless hours in the waiting room, praying for good news. Dr. Thompson emerging from surgery, still in his scrubs, telling her with a gentle smile that her son would be fine. The passenger you knocked down, the manager said quietly, was Dr. Thompson's father. Robert Thompson, Vietnam veteran, flying to San Francisco to visit his son. Rita's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She remembered how Dr. Thompson had visited Billy every day during his week-long hospital stay, bringing him comic books and telling jokes to keep his spirits up. How he'd given Rita his personal number in case she ever needed anything. How he'd refused any special thanks, saying simply, "It's what we do." "I saved all the photos," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. She scrolled through to find one particular image, Billy's last checkup 2 weeks ago. In it, Dr. Thompson was showing Billy his old medical school photos, including one with his father at his graduation. The same man she had knocked down just hours ago. The HR representative cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, we need to," but Rita cut him off, standing up suddenly. "I need to make this right," she said, her voice stronger now. "Not for my job, not for the airline's image, but because they helped my son walk again." She told them about the bicycle accident, about Billy's crushed leg, about how Dr. Thompson had spent extra hours planning and performing a complex surgery that other doctors said was too risky. How he had personally supervised Billy's physical therapy. How her son had gone from potentially losing his leg to playing soccer again, all because of Dr. Thompson's dedication. The room fell silent as Rita shared her story, tears streaming down her face. The senior manager looked at his colleagues, then back at Rita. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, "there's a way to turn this situation around. But first, you need to talk to them, both Dr. Thompson and his father." Through the conference room windows, the late afternoon sun illuminated a photo on the wall, one of the airline's motto about connecting people across the world. Rita stared at it, thinking about how connections worked in mysterious ways. How the doctor who had saved her son was the same man whose father she had treated so poorly. As the meeting wrapped up, Rita pulled up the last photo she had of Billy with Dr. Thompson, taken just 2 weeks ago. Her son was standing unassisted, beaming at the camera. "I'll make this right," she whispered to herself. "I have to." The airline officials began discussing plans for addressing the situation, but Rita was already mentally composing what she would say to the Thompsons. Sometimes, she realized, life's worst moments can lead to its most meaningful connections. She just hoped they would give her the chance to prove it. The children's ward at San Francisco General Hospital was quieter than usual that afternoon. Colorful paintings decorated the walls, their cheerful scenes a stark contrast to the nervous energy in the air. Dr. Thompson had arranged for the meeting to take place in the hospital's family room, a warm space with comfortable couches and large windows overlooking the city. Robert Thompson sat in a plush armchair, his cane resting against the side. Though still sore from the incident, he had insisted on coming to the hospital rather than resting at his son's home. If this lady helped raise a boy brave enough to go through what Billy did, he had told his son, then she deserves a chance to be heard. The door opened slowly, and Rita stepped in, holding her son Billy's hand. The 12-year-old boy walked with just the slightest hint of a limp, a remarkable recovery from his accident. When he saw Dr. Thompson, his face lit up with a bright smile, but then he noticed Robert and grew quiet, recognizing him from the viral video. "Mr. Thompson," Rita began, her voice trembling slightly. But before she could continue, Billy stepped forward, his young face serious and determined. "Sir," he said to Robert, "Dr. Thompson saved my leg. He's the reason I can walk." He gestured to the slight scar visible below his shorts. "When I saw the video of what happened to you, I cried because my mom always taught me to be kind to everyone, especially those who serve our country." Robert's stern expression softened as he looked at the boy. Dr. Thompson watched from the doorway, letting the scene unfold naturally. Rita stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes as her son continued speaking. "Mom didn't sleep last night," Billy added. "She kept watching old videos of when I was in the hospital, and she told me about how Dr. Thompson would come check on me even when it wasn't his shift. She said she couldn't believe she hurt the father of the man who saved her son." The room fell quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital corridor. Robert shifted in his chair, wincing slightly from his bruised hip. "Come here, young man," he said gently, patting the chair beside him. Billy looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. As Billy sat down, Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. "This is me, about your age," he said, showing Billy a black and white picture of a young boy in baseball uniform. "Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most beautiful friendships." Rita finally found her voice. "Mr. Thompson, when I realized who you were, who your son was, I've never felt such shame and gratitude at the same time. Your son spent countless hours saving my boy's leg, and I—" Her voice cracked with emotion. Dr. Thompson stepped forward then, placing a reassuring hand on Reba's shoulder. "Dad," he said, "remember what you always told me about forgiveness? About how it's not just about saying sorry, but about understanding each other's stories." Robert nodded slowly, looking at the photograph still in his hands. "You know," he said, "when I was in Vietnam, I learned that every person has a story worth hearing. Rita, why don't you sit down and tell me about this brave young man of yours?" Rita sat down, wiping her eyes. For the next hour, they shared stories about Billy's accident and recovery, about Robert's military service, about Dr. Thompson's journey to become a surgeon. The tension in the room gradually melted away, replaced by something warmer, more understanding. Billy showed Robert his collection of hospital wristbands that he had kept from his stays, proudly explaining how each one represented a step in his recovery. Robert, in turn, shared stories about his own son's childhood, making everyone laugh with tales of young Dr. Thompson's earliest attempts to operate on his stuffed animals. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the windows, something remarkable had happened in that family room. What had started as an attempt at reconciliation had transformed into the beginning of an unexpected friendship. The viral video that had brought them together was already beginning to fade into the background, replaced by genuine human connection. Before they left, Billy asked if he could take a picture with both Robert and Dr. Thompson. "For my wall of heroes," he explained shyly. As they posed together, Rita caught Dr. Thompson's eye, and they shared a knowing look. Sometimes healing comes in the most unexpected ways, and the hardest moments can lead to the most meaningful connections. 3 months after the incident that sparked millions of views and countless discussions, the airline's main training center was buzzing with activity. The large conference room was filled with flight attendants, both new and experienced, all gathered for a special presentation. At the front of the room stood Robert Thompson, leaning lightly on his cane, his veteran's cap proudly displayed. "Today," he began, his voice carrying years of wisdom, "we're not here to talk about what went wrong on that flight. We're here to talk about what went right afterward." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man whose story had touched so many hearts. Rita sat in the front row, next to her son Billy, who was eagerly recording the session on his tablet. The airline had not only reinstated her, but had also made her a key part of their new training program focused on handling passengers with special needs and veterans. "Life isn't about the mistakes we make," Robert continued, gesturing to Rita with a warm smile. "It's about how we learn from them. This lovely lady here didn't just apologize, she helped create a whole new way of thinking about passenger care." The screen behind him displayed photos from the past few months, Rita working with veteran groups, Billy's recovery milestones, and the growing friendship between their families. One picture showed Billy and Robert at a baseball game, both wearing matching caps, their smiles genuine and bright. Dr. Thompson had taken time from his busy schedule to join the presentation. He stood up and shared how this incident had led to the hospital creating a new program where medical staff received training about treating veteran patients with extra care and understanding. "Sometimes," he said, looking at his father with pride, "the best medicine isn't found in surgical rooms or prescription bottles. It's found in the moments when we stop, listen, and truly understand each other." The airline's new training protocol, developed with input from veteran organizations, had become a model for other airlines. They called it the Thompson Protocol, focusing on patience, understanding, and respect for all passengers, especially those with invisible challenges or disabilities. Billy, who had become something of a celebrity at the airline's headquarters, shared his story too. "Before my accident, I didn't understand why some people needed extra time or help," he said, his voice clear and confident. "Now I know that everyone has their own battles, and kindness makes everything better." The viral video that had once brought shame and anger was now used as a teaching tool, but with a different message. It wasn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, it was about learning and growing. The comment sections, once filled with anger, now overflowed with stories of hope and similar experiences of redemption. Rita's colleagues had noticed a change in her. She became known for her exceptional patience with elderly passengers and those needing extra assistance. Her story inspired other flight attendants to share their own experiences of learning and growth. As the presentation ended, Robert pulled out something special, a small album filled with letters and photos from people who had been touched by their story. "These," he said, holding it up, "are the real treasures that came from that difficult day." The airline's customer service ratings had improved significantly since implementing the new protocols. Other companies began reaching out, asking to learn from their experience. What had started as a potential PR disaster had transformed into a movement of compassion and understanding. Later that evening, both families gathered at Dr. Thompson's house for dinner, a tradition they had started shortly after their reconciliation. Billy showed Robert his latest physical therapy progress, while Rita and Dr. Thompson discussed plans for expanding the training program to other airlines. As they sat around the dinner table, Robert raised his glass in a toast. "To mistakes that teach us, to forgiveness that heals us, and to friendships that transform us," he said, his eyes twinkling. Everyone raised their glasses, even Billy with his apple juice, understanding that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The story had come full circle. The viral video that had once threatened to destroy careers and reputations had instead built bridges, created friendships, and sparked positive change throughout an entire industry. It served as a reminder that sometimes life's most painful moments can lead to its most beautiful transformations. As the sun set over San Francisco, casting a golden glow through the windows, these two families, brought together by chance, bound together by choice, continued sharing stories, dreams, and laughter, proving that the best endings aren't really endings at all, but beautiful new beginnings.